All right, cool. Let's get started. So, hi, my name is Tiffany, and I'm here to introduce our lovely hosts and the rest of the workshop. So, this workshop is an introduction to React hooks, including having functional React basics embedded into our workshop. This is part of a larger national initiative among Hack for Impact as a national organization to introduce React and other fundamental programming basics. So here we have our lovely hosts, Jackie and Kendall, who are tech leads at Hack for Impact UIUC. In addition, we have a survey that I will be sending into the chat right now that will be covering some of our demographics or survey data and feedback that we really would want to get you guys to fill out over the course of this workshop so that whatever feedback goes back to our hosts, as well as we can get a sense of who came out to the workshop and what you would want from a future workshop. In addition to that, we really excited that you're all here, and hopefully this can help contribute to the greater tech x social good. Um, oh, wait. We don't have permission to the form. Okay, yes, we can definitely change that. I'll change that in a moment. I'll let you guys know when it's been updated. But yeah, without further ado, let's get started.
Okay, awesome. Thanks, Tiffany. So like Tiffany said, we're going to be doing a short intro to React hooks and then have a workshop at the end. So we're going to first go do a brief introduction of components as a refresher. We do kind of assume you have some React knowledge before the workshop. Then we'll intro a few hooks, leave time for a little bit of questions before our workshop, do that, and then have time for final questions at the end.
All right, so to kick us off, we're going to cover components. And so a component is, as basis, a reusable piece of UI. You can think of it as a bundle between logic and renderable content. And in this case, we write that as JSX. And so generally how we use a component is that we pass in props to the component, and we don't really need to know the implementation details of it. All we need to know is what we need to pass in as props, and then expect to be returned a view or UI. And there's actually two main ways to write a component. And this is either as a class or as a function. And for the purposes of this presentation, we're going to be focusing on functional components. Next slide. Sweet. So what is a functional component? So functional components have been around for quite a while. Primarily, as you can see, is pretty much just a function that returns just some HTML or JSX. And so we pass in these props as an object parameter, and then you get what we passed in. So in this case, with our example with Hello World, we expect a name prop, and this is pretty much just a string. And then we actually display this using the syntax with curly braces. This is where the JSX part comes in. And then in the app, which is also a component, this can be seen as like the central component. We pass in name as a prop, and for the name we pass in Jackie. And so now you can see that's rendered in the central image. All right, so now let's talk about how to actually go from functional components to actual like real components, how have like dynamic functionality with them. So hooks were introduced in React 16.8. So it's a fairly recent development. And these are actually used to hook into state and life cycle methods using functional components. And so we'll go more in depth on what exactly that means. But essentially, this allows us to have more dynamic functionality with a functional component, as opposed to just returning a view or just HTML. And so this allows us to actually replace functional components as class components, allowing us to create cleaner code and having more efficient code. And so our first hook that we're going to look at is useState. And so if you're familiar with React previously, you probably already know pretty well about state, but just to just to reiterate, state variables are managed within the component, and they are affected by actions such as button clicks or foreign inputs, on change events, anything like that. And so when a state variable changes, the entire component re-renders. And so in functional components, it's a little bit more complicated, and that's why we have to use a useState hook. And so when we call this hook, it returns an array that contains the variable and then a setter function. And so this sort of focuses on immutability at its core. And so when we call set count or the setter function, this is prompting the component to re-render. And so as you can see in our example, I kind of jumped ahead there, actually, yeah. You're fine. So in our example, so we have count and set count. And so when we call useState, we pass in this value 0, and that's actually our initial state. Since we passed in 0, that's gonna be the first thing that we see. And so when we return the viewable JSX, then we can see we connect set count to on click for the button. And so when we click it, the count increments by 1. And so we can see that in the bottom GIF. So yeah. Now our next hook that we're going to cover is useEffect. This is a very powerful hook. There's a lot of different use cases for it, but at its core, it allows you to create side effects for when state variable changes. And so this can be used to mimic lifecycle functions. So this can be mounting a component, so when it first renders, or when a variable changes or anything like that. And so basically just side effects. And it takes in 2 parameters, which is a callback function and an array of optional dependencies. And so in our example here, probably best explained here is, so building off of our previous example with the counter. So when we click the button, we're actually going to use the count variable as a dependency for this effect that will change the document title to you clicked count times. And so document title is basically just the tab name. And so you can see in the GIF, when we click me, it also updates the tab title as well.
Just to quickly interject, someone in the chat asked, what are lifecycle functions? Those are part of class components, which we aren't covering today. If you don't know a class component, it's not really necessary to know for a functional component. So it's completely fine if you have no idea what they are. We just kind of mentioned them for those who are kind of converting from class to functional. Okay. So if we're going to dive a little deeper on this dependency array, which is a little bit more complicated and it's kind of difficult to wrap your head around. This basically determines when we are going to run the effect or the function that we pass into useEffect. So in this case, the function is setting document.title to you clicked count times. So you can see here in this example, right, we have count in our dependency array, and that is our state variable. So we're basically saying every time count changes, you're running this effect. So that kind of covers this on state change in. It's the same thing with props. If you include props in there, every time that prop changes, then the effect will run. And you can include any number of props or state variables. It just means that every time any one of those variables change, you're going to run that effect function. Another instance here is if you have an empty dependency array. So that means you're only going to run the effect once the component first renders, and that's the only time you're running it. So that's pretty useful for things like API calls, which we'll go into later. And then one other thing to note about the dependency array is that, right, you can include any proper state variable that you want, but you have to include props or state variables that you use in the function you pass into useEffect, because right, it's called a dependency array, and that function depends on those specific variables. And you can kind of get into trouble if you don't include those in your dependency array. So having an example with an empty dependency array, right? I said that it can be used to fetch data from an API call. So here, right, we're just fetching some endpoint that's going to return us some data, and we're going to map each of those text lines to a paragraph, and then just return if our data state variable is not null, then we're just going to return this list of paragraphs. And if it is null, we're just going to say, okay, no data yet. And you can see that we have our data state variable declared up here with its initial value to null. So if you're looking at this GIF, right, it starts out with no data yet, meaning the API has not finished calling yet. And then after it finishes, right, we wait a few seconds and we see all this data. So that's kind of, you can think of it as in a component, right? You fetch an API, or you call an API to get some like initial data to populate, let's say, a gallery of images. So you put some like filler images there when you're fetching your data, and then once it populates, this useEffect runs and sets your state variable for your, gallery or whatever it is. Okay, so, and no worries if that was a little confusing. It's a lot to kind of take in. But we're going to move on to another hook called useMemo. So useMemo is very useful for when you have expensive computations that don't rely on a lot of different props or state variables, and you don't want to have to recompute like the variable every single time that your component renders. So useMemo memoizes or saves the return value of a given function to a variable. So if you're looking at this first example right here, right, we're passing in a prop called foods. You can assume that this is some array of food objects with properties name and expiration date. And we're just saying, okay, we're going to map each of these objects to have an H2 and a P tag, and just save that into a list. And then render that. So you can kind of see that on the right here, right? We have blueberries, chips, and milk, and that's rendered. So then here we have, we will only recompute our food list value only when a dependency in the dependency array has changed. So again, we're looking at a dependency array. It's very similar to useEffect. I guess like the main difference between useMemo and useEffect is that useEffect just runs a function when a dependency has changed, whereas useMemo recalculates a value. In this case, it's this list of JSX, and it depends on the prop foods. So we're kind of assuming that foods isn't really going to be changed that much, and that's why we're memoizing it. If foods did change a lot, then it probably wouldn't really make sense to memoize it, because we're just be kind of wasting resources. And then kind of just to have a more simple example down here, we have our function calculate primes. We can assume it takes in, a min and max. So I'm saying I want to calculate the primes between 1 and 10,000. We can assume that's a very expensive computation. So that's why it would be useful to use memo here to just get our primes. And we're passing in an empty dependency array saying we're only going to run this once when the component first mounts, and no matter how many times it re-renders, we've still only run this function once, which is going to save a lot of computation time. Okay, so we are going to move on to a short workshop now. Does anyone have any questions before we go into that? You can like unmute and ask, or ask in the chat, or PM one of us. Okay, no worries if there are none now. You can always ask during the workshop or afterwards. Oh. How did you make this slides PowerPoint presentation? We're using SlidesGo. Yes, there's the credit sign that will show at the end. So from Dipro, does a change in the value of a useMemo based variable initiate a re-render? So are you saying in this example, if a variable in the dependency changes, or if like the foods list variable changes or like is recomputed?
So when food list changes.
Okay. So from my understanding, I'm not going to say I'm going to be 100% correct on this. Food list will only change when foods changes, right? So that's a prop. And whenever a prop changes, a re-render always happens.
Okay.
So you can just kind of think of this as like a normal variable that just sometimes saves time.
Okay.
Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Okay. Okay, I'll start explaining the workshop now, and if there are any more questions, I can go back to them. So for our workshop, we're gonna have you guys create kind of your own mini Reddit browser-ish. I can show what the final product would ideally look like. Okay, so basically what we have here is you have an input to input the name of a subreddit you'd like to go to, and it's going to show you all of the like hot posts from there at the current time. So I can type in like, if I don't like React and I'm going to look at Angular, then I'm going to type in Angular, hit go, and it'll show me new posts from there. And then we're going to say you can favorite posts just by clicking on them. Pretty simple UI, nothing fancy. I can go back to looking at React and say, oh no, I like React better, and favorite a post from there. So we have provided you with some starter code for this. So far, the code that we provided is just handling like the search. So typing in, your subreddit, and basically we're passing that subreddit prop down to this Reddit component. And in the Reddit component, that's where all of your code is going to go. So here we've just set up the headers for your favorite posts, hot post from the subreddit, and then you can use these tags to render the post titles because we have the CSS for that. Okay, Kendall, can you send the link to the starter code in chat?
Yeah, sure thing.
Okay. Yeah, so we kind of broke this up into steps for you guys. Step one is just making the API call to get all of these like hot posts from the subreddit, and we've included this helper code right here in a comment. You don't need to like search the internet for how to call the Reddit API. Step two would just be rendering all of those posts by displaying their titles like you saw. And then step three is if you click the post, it'll go to your favorites. And if you want, you can implement adding the feature of if you click a post in your favorites, it'll remove it from your favorites. Yeah, so does anyone have any questions on that? Okay, I'll assume no for now, and you guys can go ahead and get started. I think we'll start out with waiting about 10 minutes for now. If you have any questions, feel free to put in the chat, unmute, DM Kendall or I. I can like flip back to other slides, or you can like research on the internet if you want. It would also be helpful if you're done with the first part to mark like done in your Zoom name, so we can kind of see if we need to extend the time or shorten the time. And after each step, we'll go over the solution for that. So yeah, I wish you guys luck. Okay, I think it should be enabled now for you to rename yourselves. Okay, I'm sending a link in the chat to be able to view the presentation, so you can go back and look at the slides. Hopefully it works. Okay, I see people hopping on, so that's awesome.
All right, everyone. How are we doing on the first part here? I guess if you guys want to have a react, thumbs up.
Okay, how about if you're still working and would like more time, give us a thumbs up or any emoji, I guess. Okay. We'll check in after a few more minutes then. Ethan, off the top of my head, I have no idea. I like briefly Googled it and it looks like something with cores, but uh, yeah, we love cores. Hopefully that shouldn't be an issue because with, I don't know, when we were able to, or we were testing this out and like making the final version, I don't think we ran into a cores issue. The code that I pasted here should be good.
We're getting a new Bootcamp in Georgia. It's beginning to shrink and shrink and shrink.
All right, so I think we're going to cover the first part for right now. Yeah, this is definitely a tricky part here. So yeah. Okay, so our first part that we needed to write was to use the useEffect hook, primarily to fetch the data. So just using the code that was commented up above, we can just put that into a async function. And yeah, we did not cover async functions or whatnot, but pretty much it allows you to call a function without stopping the main execution thread. And so after just pasting this code, the idea is to have a state variable called post, which we will set, which we will update when we get the data from the request. and set posts. And so when we do that, then we take the data and then we essentially map the return value that we get to just return the text, which will be c.data. It's a little complicated. You definitely need to have like some print statements, some console logs to see what you were working with. But yeah, this is the general idea. And for the array of dependencies, we needed to use subreddit and set posts. And so essentially these are like two main things that we use in the function. Subreddit, if it updates, which it will when we connect it to the form, this is when it updates, then we want to refetch. So that's why we have that in there. And then set post as well, sort of as a formality with hooks, you also want to include them as well.
Yeah, you can kind of think like earlier. See, we were talking about an empty dependency array for API fetching. It would essentially be the same thing with this, except let's say I only wanted to go to the React.js subreddit. We would delete that and just, you know, hard code this variable to be React.js. Does anyone have any questions so far on the solution or anything else? I'll give you guys some time to, actually, I'll just copy this into chat so that you guys can look at it on your own. And then you guys can start working on part 2. So this is taking those posts that we fetched and just rendering them as a list. If you guys don't have any questions, please ask us. You can DM us if you're scared. I would be very scared asking in front of everyone. It's like making me nervous that people aren't asking questions because this is a difficult concept to understand. So yeah, just putting that out there.
All right, cool. I think we'll get started on going over step 2. And for this one, we're just building off of, yeah, you're fine. And so for this one, the main idea is just to take what we've already set from the fetch post. So after we call set post, now we know that post will be updated in the next iteration of rendering. So now we're going to call map, which is going to transform every post or the text that we got from the fetch into a list element. And so to do this, we just call the li tag, and then we just inject the post ID for the key, because React will complain if we don't, and then the post title. And that's about it for this part.
Yeah. And you can see it should work like going to different subreddits again. If you run Angular, then it should fetch those again, right? Because the subreddit prop is changing, triggering this useEffect, triggering the set posts, and then causing this to re-render. Yes, again, so does anyone have questions on this part? And I sent the link in the chat to the solution. Okay, yeah, then if not, see, I got one question asking why does set post need to be in the dependency array? Let's see if it complains if it's not in there. Honestly, I think it like depends on the linter. I could be wrong on this, but in the dependency array, React wants you to put everything that was used, any outside variables basically that was used in the effect, right? So the outside variables used in this effect are the subreddit prop and then the set post, since React says a function is a variable. So that's kind of why we included it in the dependency array, even though set post is never really going to change at all. Let's see. And let me know if that doesn't answer your question. Someone else asked, how can we take in subreddit and have the post array? I don't know if I'm understanding your question correctly, but basically subreddit is this string that we're getting here that we're inputting after we hit go. And that is what we put into our API call here. So we're saying, whatever string we input after we hit go, send that prop to this Reddit component, and useEffect sees that and says, oh, well, subreddit is in our dependency array and it changed from React.js to AngularJS. So that means we have to run this effect function, which is this fetch data. And that is how we get our new post, right? We call reddit.com/r/angularjs.json and get our data from that and get our post array. Hopefully that answered your question. And if it didn't, let me know.
Yeah, and the next part, I guess the final part here is to actually have the functionality of clicking a post. And so if this is in the hot post section, this will add it to the favorites. And if we click a post in the favorite section, this will be like more of the bonus part. Then it will remove it from the favorite section. So.
And you can do the click functionality by just adding like an on click prop here. And that should work fine. Did I just like mess up the slide order? Okay.
All right, everyone. So we're going to cover our final part here. I know this has been a little bit more shorter time, but so just to go over what we've added, mainly using the on-click event and having another state variable, which is favorite posts. And so basically, this is just going to hold all the posts that we click in the hot post section. And so as we can see in our useMemo callback, we set an on-click function. And in this, we call set favorite posts. And so this is a little bit of like fancy syntax, but essentially we're just copying all the previous favorite posts and then adding the post that we just clicked to that. And so that is going to update our favorite posts list here. And then I guess following suit with the favorite post part. So similar idea, we map all our favorite posts to a list element. Same idea with the key and the content. So injecting that JavaScript there. And then on click, it's a little different for this one. So when we're setting favorite posts, we actually want to slice or cut out the specific element that we chose, and then add the rest. So it's kind of just like slicing out one piece of this array. And that's about it, really. So yeah, thank you guys so much for coming with us, doing this workshop. And so, yeah, we do have a feedback form, and we would love for you guys to fill that out. But thank you guys so much for coming, and let us know if there's any final questions. And yeah.
I think we'll stick around a little bit after the end to see if there's any final questions, or if you just want to talk to us about, whatever. I'll make sure to paste all the Code Sandbox links into the presentation again, so you can refer to it whenever you want. I know the last part was a little bit rushed and might have been a little bit confusing. But yeah, thank you everybody for coming.